The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, painting the plains in gold and crimson, as if the sky itself were warning of the danger that lingered in the air. Tyan rode alone, the weight of his bow and quiver heavy on his back, his horse's hooves stirring up a cloud of dirt with every step. He was a warrior of the Apache, a man known for his courage but also for a solitude that clung to him like a second skin. He had wandered far from his tribe today, following whispers of smoke and movement in the distance, unsure what he would find but driven by a sense he could not name. The clash of metal and a sharp cry pierced the wind. Tyan's horse halted, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. He strained his eyes, catching sight of a small figure struggling against a band of armed men. It was a woman, alone, her movements desperate and graceful, her strength evident even as she stumbled under their blows. Tyan's instincts flared. He could not let this happen. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward, silent as the shadows gathering in the canyon walls. By the time he reached her, the attackers had scattered, leaving the woman crumpled on the ground, clutching her side. Blood darkened her clothes, staining the dust beneath her. Tyan dismounted swiftly, his eyes scanning the area for any lingering threat. The world seemed to hold its breath, the wind now whispering only through the dry grass. He knelt beside her, taking in the shallow breaths and the pale skin slick with sweat. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice steady but low. The woman shook her head, fear mingling with pain. Tyan did not waste words. He lifted her gently, supporting her weight as though she were fragile, even as he felt the strength in her arms gripping his neck. Step by careful step, he led her toward a shaded ravine he knew would offer temporary shelter. Every movement was deliberate, every pause measured to keep her from screaming in agony. Once hidden from sight, he lowered her onto a bed of soft brush, the only comfort he could offer in the unforgiving terrain. Tyan's hands were steady as he examined the wound, a deep gash across her ribcage, cruel and unrelenting. He tore a strip from his own shirt, cleaning the blood as best he could. Her eyes, wide with both terror and resilience, met his. "You'll be all right," he said softly, though even he knew the words were more hope than truth. Her lips parted, a soft sigh escaping, but she said nothing. Tyan's hands worked with care, his fingers steady but gentle as he applied pressure to slow the bleeding. There was a silence then, heavy and intimate, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling above. He noticed the fine line of sweat on her brow, the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her dark hair clung to her face despite the blood and dust. A strange impulse rose in him, one that startled even Tyan. He leaned closer, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. Instinctively, he pressed a brief, reverent kiss to the wound, a gesture meant to ease pain, a ritual of healing passed down through his ancestors. The woman gasped, eyes widening not just from the sensation but from the vulnerability it demanded. Tyan froze for a heartbeat, the weight of connection heavy in the air. She looked at him then, fully seeing him for the first time, not as a warrior, not as a rescuer, but as a man. And in that gaze, something fragile and unspoken passed between them. He turned away first, uncertain of what had stirred in his chest. Her warmth lingered like a spark, a quiet challenge to the solitude he had always worn like armor. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and distant fire. Tyan knew the danger was far from over. Enemies still roamed these lands, and time would not wait for wounds to heal. Yet as he sat beside her, vigilant and watchful, he realized that something had already changed. In saving her, he had glimpsed a truth he had long denied. Some wounds, physical or otherwise, could not be healed alone, and some hearts, even a warrior's, were not meant to remain untouched. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in twilight. Shadows stretched and mingled with the dust, but Tyan's resolve was clear. He would protect her. He would tend to her wound. And though he did not yet understand the danger it posed, he knew he was already losing his heart. The night was quiet, though the darkness felt heavy around the small ravine where Tyan had carried Alara. The stars peeked through the gaps in the canyon walls, cold and distant, but they cast enough light for him to work. He built a small fire, the flames flickering and reflecting in her wide, wary eyes. Every snap of a branch made her flinch. Every rustle of the wind tugged at her nerves. Tyan's hands were steady as he wrapped a fresh bandage around her wound, the rough cloth pressed firmly yet gently. "You must rest," he said quietly, his tone more command than request, though there was no anger in it. If you move too much, it will open again. Ilara tried to protest, but the effort of sitting up made her wince and she sank back onto the soft bed of brush. Tyan studied her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the subtle tremor in her fingers. She was strong, yes, but this strength was tempered with fragility, and he felt a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years. I should be able to stand, she whispered, her voice rough from pain and dust. I can't just lie here. Tyan shook his head, the firelight catching the shadows across his face. Strength is not always standing, he said. Sometimes it is letting someone else help you. The words were simple, but in the silence of the canyon they carried weight. Ilara's eyes softened, and she allowed herself to lean back just for a moment into his presence. She noticed the way his hands moved, careful and precise, yet capable of sudden force if needed. There was a strange contrast about him, both dangerous and gentle, and it unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. Hours passed. Tyan tended to her with skill and patience, using a mixture of traditional herbs and careful touch. He whispered instructions in his native tongue, words she could not understand but which carried an almost hypnotic calm. The pain in her side dulled, the shallow breaths growing steadier, the tension in her body loosening, and yet between them, an unspoken hesitation lingered. Tyan wanted to ask if she trusted him, if she would let him stay by her side, but the words caught in his throat. Pride and fear twisted together, holding him back. Ilara, for her part, fought the instinct to draw away. Every glance he cast her way, every careful touch seemed to spark something she had thought buried, an attraction she did not dare name. At one point, a sudden shadow fell across the firelight. Tyan's hand shot to his bow. Ilara, startled, followed his gaze. But it was only a small coyote, sniffing at the edge of the clearing. Tyan let out a slow breath, and the tension between them ebbed just slightly. You saved me, Ilara said after a long pause, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful than before. Why did you? She trailed off, unsure how to finish the question. Tyan looked down at the fire, his face unreadable. Because no one should suffer alone, he said finally. And because I could. There was nothing more in his tone, no explanation, no sentiment. But somehow, it was enough. The night stretched on, and Tyan continued to watch over her. He did not speak unless necessary, yet his presence was constant, a silent promise of protection. Ilara found herself studying him, the sharpness of his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he was focused, the slight hesitation in his movements when he touched her bandage. She realized that she did not feel fear anymore. She felt trust, and perhaps something more. In the stillness, Tyan caught himself thinking of her long after she drifted into a restless sleep. He noted the quiet rise and fall of her chest, the way her hair framed her face, the faint crease of worry on her brow. He felt a pull in his chest, a strange, unfamiliar ache. He had saved many in battle, tended many wounds, yet never had a saving act left him this unsettled. He understood with a slow certainty that the bond forming between them was unlike anything he had known. By the first light of dawn, the fire had burned low and the canyon began to glow in soft pinks and oranges. Ilara stirred, her eyes blinking open at the sight of him still watching over her. For the first time she smiled, not from relief, not from gratitude, but from recognition. She saw in Tyan someone who was more than a warrior, someone capable of tenderness and perhaps of love. Tyan met her gaze and felt a spark of something he did not name, a warning, a promise, a question of the heart. He turned away, busying himself with the remaining tasks, but he could not ignore it. Something had shifted between them quietly, subtly, irreversibly, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The day broke over the canyon with a pale, hesitant light. Tyan had been awake long before the sun, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger, his senses honed from years of survival in the wild. Ilara lay beside the smoldering remains of last night's fire, her body still tender from the wound, but her eyes bright with determination. Even in weakness, she carried a spark of defiance that both startled and intrigued him. Tyan had prepared a simple breakfast, water from a nearby stream, some foraged roots and a few dried berries, but Ilara barely touched it. Her focus was elsewhere. She scanned the terrain, her eyes narrowing at distant silhouettes of trees and ridges. We need to move, she said softly, but with a firmness that surprised Tyan. You're not healed enough to travel far. he warned, his voice calm but firm. One wrong step and the wound could reopen. She flinched at the thought, a shadow of fear crossing her face. Tyann noticed it instantly. With a decisive motion, he knelt beside her, removing the bandage carefully to inspect the gash. The skin around it was raw, swollen, and pink. The fight had been brutal, the wound deeper than he had first assessed. "We need to clean it again," he murmured, his hands steady but gentle. "It's the only way to prevent infection." Elara hesitated, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of vulnerability she could not hide. Tyann noticed the slight tremble in her hands and the sharp intake of breath as she braced herself. He could have asked her to lie down to endure it silently. But instead, he knelt lower, positioning himself at her side, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "You'll feel some pain," he warned, though the words were almost redundant. His fingers parted the torn cloth carefully, and his palms pressed lightly against her skin, cleaning the wound with cool water from a leaf. The moment was intimate, almost sacred, charged with unspoken tension. Elara flinched once, her head turning slightly, and Tyann instinctively reached out, steadying her. In that moment, instinct overpowered reason. He leaned closer, pressing a tender kiss directly to the wound. It was not an act of passion, it was an act of care, ritual, and courage. But the closeness, the warmth of his lips on her skin sent a jolt through both of them. Elara gasped, instinctively reaching to push him away, yet found her hands trembling. There was shock, yes, but beneath it something else stirred. Gratitude, recognition, and the faintest whisper of something more. She could feel his steady pulse, the warmth radiating from him, and in the briefest of moments, she understood that this warrior, this stranger who had saved her life, had unknowingly broken down the walls around her heart. Tyann pulled back, just slightly, as if startled by the intensity of the connection. His dark eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. The canyon seemed to hold its breath with them. The wind stilled, the birds ceased their calls, and even the rustling leaves paused. "You are strong," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "And you will survive this. But you must trust me to help." Elara's lips parted, her voice barely audible. I do trust you." The words hung in the air like fragile glass, and Tyann felt a pull in his chest, an ache he could not name. He had always been cautious with his heart, guarding it against loss, against pain. But in that instant he realized that he could no longer remain untouched. The act of saving her wound, of leaning into her vulnerability, had already ensnared him. They continued the ritual quietly, the distance between them, both physical and emotional, shrinking with every careful motion. Tyann could feel the weight of responsibility, yes, but also a thrill of closeness that was new, alarming, and intoxicating. Elara, for her part, did not pull away, letting him care for her with a trust she had never offered anyone before. By the time the wound was bandaged again, secured tightly and carefully, something unspoken had passed between them, a promise, a spark, a bridge built on mutual courage and fragile intimacy. Tyann glanced at the horizon, noting the danger that still lingered. But now his mind lingered more on her than on the world outside. As they prepared to move, their hands brushed. Neither drew away, neither spoke. Yet the electricity in that simple touch said everything they could not yet admit. That saving a life could awaken a heart, and that sometimes the deepest wounds were not the ones visible to the eye. The canyon stretched before them, brightening under the sun's slow ascent, but Tyann knew in a quiet, certain way that the path ahead would be more complicated, not because of danger, but because of what had begun between them in the shadow of blood and healing. He had kissed the wound to save her life, yes, but in doing so, he had unknowingly surrendered to something far more powerful, the vulnerability of the heart. The canyon had quieted, leaving only the soft whisper of wind through the scrub and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. Tyann led Elara slowly along a narrow trail, careful to keep her from stumbling over jagged rocks and loose soil. The wound was bandaged, but her steps were tentative, each one a reminder of her vulnerability. Tyann remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly. Yet his mind was elsewhere, haunted by memories he had long tried to bury. He had always been a man of action, a warrior forged in battles he had neither chosen nor welcomed. He had known loss too young, his first love taken by disease, his family scattered by conflict. Those memories were sharp, like knives that had been dulled but never sheathed. He had learned to keep his heart behind walls of solitude, convincing himself that attachment was weakness. To care, he had reasoned, was to risk devastation. But as he glanced at Alara, walking slowly beside him, her eyes alert yet filled with quiet courage, he realized that the past was already colliding with the present. Her presence awakened something he had spent years suppressing. A longing, a curiosity, a dangerous desire to protect, to nurture, to connect, Alara, he said quietly. Breaking the silence, you must understand. I am not like others. I do not trust easily. I have reasons. She looked at him, dark eyes steady, unafraid. I see it in you, she said softly. I see your caution. But I also see your heart. You just don't let it breathe. Tayen's jaw tightened. Her words were not accusatory, yet they cut deeper than any blade ever could. He wanted to turn away, to retreat into the familiar solitude he had always clung to. Yet as he watched her, something in him resisted that instinct. The honesty in her gaze, the quiet strength in her voice made him pause. They stopped near a shaded grove where a small stream carved through the rocks. Tayen knelt to drink, motioning for Alara to do the same. The water was cool and clear, reflecting the morning light in shimmering patterns. As she crouched beside him, Tayen noticed the way her hair caught the sun, how her breathing had grown steadier, and the faint hint of determination in her posture. She was more than just someone he had saved. She was a force, resilient and unyielding, and it unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. He thought of the moments he had shared with her, the silent exchanges, the touch of her hand when she steadied herself, the look in her eyes when he had kissed the wound. Each memory tugged at him, each moment a reminder that walls, no matter how strong, were meant to be broken. Why do you wander these lands alone? Alara asked after a pause, her voice curious, gentle. Your people, your tribe. Don't they need you? Tayen's eyes darkened with thought. I have my duties, he said carefully, but some paths cannot be shared. Some choices are mine alone. He struggled to maintain his composure, though the memories threatened to spill out. The battles, the deaths, the moments of helplessness. Alara placed a tentative hand on his arm, a gesture of empathy that startled him. You don't have to carry it all by yourself, she said. Not anymore. Her words were soft, but they carried weight, and Tayen felt the old familiar fear rising in his chest. To trust, to open himself, to allow another into the quiet fortress of his heart. These were things he had denied himself for too long. Yet the fear was mixed with something else, a budding recognition that perhaps he did not want to face life alone. Perhaps for the first time in years he could imagine a life with another beside him. Sharing both danger and tenderness, the grove was still, the water flowing gently beside them, the canyon around them quiet and watchful. Tayen knew that the past would never fully release its grip, that shadows of old pain would follow him always. But he also knew that Alara had arrived as a light, fragile, unpredictable, and fiercely alive. And for the first time, he considered that risking his heart might be worth the cost. He looked at her, seeing not just the woman he had saved, but a companion, a mirror to his own resilience, a challenge to the solitude he had relied upon for survival. Tayen felt the stirrings of something new, something dangerous and intoxicating. His heart, long hidden and protected, had begun to respond, quietly, insistently. As the sun climbed higher, warming the stones and the earth, Tayen led Alara onward. Each step was careful, deliberate, but also symbolic, a step away from the shadows of his past, and a tentative step toward the uncharted territory of his own heart. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon as Tayen and Alara made their cautious way along the winding trail. The air was crisp with the scent of sage and warm earth, and the distant hum of the river below mingled with the rustle of dry leaves. Each step Alara took was careful, her movements cautious yet determined, and Tayen stayed close, his hand occasionally brushing hers, never lingering, yet leaving a spark that neither could ignore. The days had blurred into a rhythm of survival. Tayen hunted and foraged, keeping them fed, while Alara assisted where she could, her hands learning the subtle tasks of tending to wounds and gathering herbs. At first, her attempts had been clumsy, awkward, but she quickly proved herself capable, resilient, and clever. Tayen observed her silently, noting the quiet ingenuity in her actions and the strength that belied her frail appearance. She had the courage to act and the wisdom to know when to wait. One afternoon, as they paused beside a small clearing, Tyan taught her how to set a simple trap for small game. "It's not just about catching food," he said, his tone low and serious. "It's about understanding the land, feeling it, respecting it." Ilara nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "And if you make a mistake?" she asked, glancing at the trap he had set earlier, now lying undisturbed in the grass. "You learn," he replied, offering her a faint smile. "Sometimes you fail, but you survive, and that is what matters." As she worked, Tyan noticed her glancing at him from time to time, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and something softer, admiration perhaps, or the faintest hint of affection. Each glance sent a warmth through his chest that he was neither prepared for nor willing to name. He averted his gaze, pretending to adjust a bundle of herbs, though his heart raced against his ribs. That evening they made camp beside a shallow stream. The water was clear, reflecting the twilight sky in muted pinks and blues. Tyen cleaned his hunting knife, methodical and silent, while Ilara tended the fire, her hands steady now, more confident than the first night he had rescued her. "You've changed," he said after a long pause, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Ilara looked up, curious. "Changed?" "Yes," he continued, choosing his words with care. "You are no longer just the woman I found in the canyon. You are strong, skilled. You make your own choices, and you face danger without flinching." A small smile tugged at her lips. "And you? Have you changed?" she asked, teasing but gentle, her eyes searching his. Tyen hesitated, the question striking deeper than expected. "Perhaps," he admitted finally, "perhaps I have learned that the heart can survive, even when it fears to open." The moment lingered, charged with unspoken meaning. Ilara felt it too, the pull of proximity, the subtle tension in every glance, every touch, every word left unsaid. They did not speak of it, but they both understood that something had shifted. Later under the stars, Tyen showed her how to identify constellations, pointing out the hunter and the river that the Apache revered. Ilara listened, fascinated, asking questions about the stories behind the stars. Tyen's voice was low, steady, but there was a softness in it now, a rare vulnerability that he allowed only in her presence. A sudden sound, a branch snapping in the distance, brought Tyen to his feet instantly, bow in hand. Ilara froze, but then, almost instinctively, she moved beside him, eyes sharp, hands ready. Together, they scanned the surrounding brush. The danger turned out to be nothing more than a deer passing through, yet the moment revealed something profound. They were no longer alone. They were a team, each instinctively protective of the other. As they settled back near the fire, their shoulders brushed again. Neither spoke, but both felt it. The bond had deepened, unspoken yet undeniable. It was built on shared danger, quiet moments, and mutual respect. Tyen realized he no longer wanted to retreat from this connection. He wanted to explore it, though he still feared the vulnerability it demanded. Ilara, for her part, understood that Tyen's hesitations were born of a history she could not fully know. But she also sensed the beginnings of trust, of affection, of something that could become more if given the chance. The canyon around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself acknowledged the delicate, growing bond between the warrior and the woman he had saved. As the night deepened, Tyen stared into the flames, thinking that no battle, no enemy had ever tested him like this. It was not the wild, nor the bandits, nor the harshness of the land that challenged him. It was the slow, undeniable pull of a heart he could no longer ignore, tethered now to a woman whose courage and kindness had broken through the walls he had spent a lifetime building. And for the first time in many long years, Tyen wondered if survival alone was enough, or if something greater awaited him, something worth risking everything for. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls, softening the jagged edges of the rocks and painting the world in muted grays and blues. Tyen and Ilara had camped near a narrow creek, its waters gurgling quietly, reflecting the pale light of dawn. For days, they had traveled together, hunted together, and shared small moments of laughter and conversation. But beneath the camaraderie, an unspoken tension lingered, a delicate thread of emotion neither had dared to name. Tyan rose before dawn, as always, and moved silently along the creek's edge, examining the terrain for any signs of danger. His mind, however, was not on the path ahead, nor on the potential threats. It lingered on Ilara, on the curve of her jaw, the strength in her hands, the warmth of her presence beside him. He had saved her life, yes, but the truth was more complicated. In saving her, he had awakened something within himself he could no longer ignore. Desire, affection, a longing for connection he had long denied. Ilara stirred behind him, her soft sigh carried by the wind. Tyan's heart skipped. He turned slowly, watching her stretch, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, eyes still half-lidded with sleep. For a moment, he simply looked, drinking in the sight of her, aware that every fiber of his being had begun to respond to her presence. "Ilara," he said quietly, stepping closer. She blinked, startled but not fearful. "There is something I must tell you." Her gaze met his, steady, patient, encouraging. "You don't have to say it if you're not ready," she replied softly, sensing the weight behind his words. Tyan shook his head, taking a deep breath. "I have spent my life keeping my heart behind walls," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "I have loved, and I have lost. I thought I could survive alone, untouched, unbroken. But meeting you has changed that. I cannot, will not, ignore it anymore." Ilara's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat Tyan feared he had overstepped, that his confession would frighten her away. But instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, grounding him. "I have felt it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "From the first moment you carried me through the canyon, I knew. I was not indifferent to you. I didn't understand it, not fully. But I trust you, Tyan. I trust the man you are, the man you show me." Tyan's chest tightened, a mixture of relief, awe, and something tender that he had not expected. He stepped closer, careful to give her space, yet unable to resist the magnetic pull between them. "I do not ask for your heart lightly," he said. "I only offer mine. I have guarded it for too long, but now I cannot keep it hidden." Ilara smiled, faint but genuine, the tension in her body softening. "Then we will share it," she said simply. "Slowly, carefully, but we will share it." The words, simple yet profound, settled over them like the morning light filtering through the mist. Tyan felt the weight of fear lift slightly, replaced by a cautious hope he had not dared to imagine. The walls around his heart were still, there, but for the first time, he felt the possibility of letting someone in without being consumed by loss. As the day progressed, they worked side by side, gathering water and foraging for edible plants, their movements fluid and natural, yet every glance and brush of skin reminded them of the confession that had passed between them. Tyan noticed the way her lips curved when she spoke, how her eyes softened when she looked at him, and he felt an ache of longing mingled with gratitude. By evening, they found a small clearing for their next camp. Tyan built a fire while Ilara cleaned the few tools they had gathered. He watched her, noting the confidence in her hands, the determination in her posture, and the quiet courage that had first drawn him to her. He realized that his confession had not created distance as he had feared, but a bridge, a fragile, luminous connection between their hearts. That night, under the canopy of stars, they sat side by side, their shoulders brushing. Tyan remained, silent, savoring the quiet intimacy, the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle rise and fall of Ilara's breathing. Words were no longer necessary. The confession had opened the door and their hearts had stepped tentatively through it, united in understanding, trust, and the promise of something deeper. For the first time, Tyan allowed himself to imagine a future, not just surviving, not just fighting, but living, alongside someone who had become more than a companion. Someone who had captured his heart with a single act of courage, a simple gesture of healing, a kiss to a wound that had bound them together forever. The sun had barely risen when the distant sounds of horses' hooves echoed through the canyon. Tyan's sharp eyes caught the movement first, a small band of men, unfamiliar and armed, approaching with intent. His heart tightened, not from fear for himself but for Ilara. He had promised to protect her, and the thought of failure was unbearable. "Ilara," he murmured, his voice low, urgent. "We are not alone. Prepare yourself." Her dark eyes widened, but she did not hesitate. Instead, she rose with a resolve that matched the tension in Tyan's chest. She had grown stronger since the day he had found her, her body and spirit tempered by adversity. Tyan felt a surge of pride mingled with worry. She was no longer fragile, she was capable, but the enemy was dangerous and the stakes high. They moved quickly, slipping into the shadows of the canyon walls. Tyan's mind raced as he assessed the approaching threat. These were not travelers or hunters. Their intent was clear in the way they rode, their hands hovering near weapons. He calculated the distance, the angle of attack, and the terrain, forming a plan in seconds. Ilara followed his lead, moving silently beside him. Tyan glanced at her, impressed by her focus and courage. "Stay close," he whispered. "Trust me." As the attackers drew nearer, Tyan signaled her to take cover behind a boulder. He stepped forward slightly, bow in hand, eyes scanning for the first sign of aggression. A figure separated from the rest of the group, scouting ahead, and Tyan's arrow flew true, striking the ground just ahead to startle rather than harm. The figure faltered and the rest hesitated, giving Tyan and Ilara a moment to reposition. Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a small branch, instinctively holding it like a weapon. Tyan noticed but said nothing. Her courage spoke louder than words. When a second figure approached too closely, she moved with precision, pushing him off balance just enough to give Tyan a clear shot. The man stumbled, and the group reeled back. Tyan's eyes met hers for an instant, a silent acknowledgement of her bravery. The attackers regrouped, circling closer. Tyan realized that remaining in the canyon was too risky. "We must move," he said urgently. "Follow me and do exactly as I do." They fled along a narrow ridge, the wind whipping against their faces, the canyon floor far below. Ilara's breath came in quick, steadying gasps, but she kept pace. Tyan's mind was entirely focused on keeping her safe, predicting every step, every potential hazard. And in that focus, he realized how deeply his feelings had entwined with the responsibility he bore for her life. Suddenly, a rider broke from the enemy line, charging straight toward them. Tyan acted instinctively, stepping between Ilara and the rider, drawing the man's attention. With a swift movement, he disarmed him, using his momentum to hurl the attacker aside. Ilara froze for a heartbeat, but then moved to aid him, grabbing a fallen weapon and positioning herself strategically. Together, they repelled the remaining attackers long enough to find a hidden ravine that provided temporary safety. Breathing heavily, they collapsed behind the rocks, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Tyan looked at her, really looked, noticing the dirt smudged on her cheeks, the determination in her eyes, and the steady calm despite the chaos. "You were remarkable," he said, voice soft but filled with awe. Ilara smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I had a good teacher," she replied, her tone teasing yet warm. The moment lingered, but danger was far from over. Tyan knew that the attackers could regroup, that the threat was ongoing. Yet in that fleeting pause, he understood something profound. They were stronger together. The bond between them had been tested and proven resilient. Courage was no longer his alone. It had become theirs. As they rested, hidden from view, Tyan's gaze softened. He realized that his feelings for Ilara had grown beyond mere attraction. They were rooted in admiration, trust, and the recognition of shared survival. Every risk he had taken to protect her now carried a personal cost. The more he shielded her, the more he acknowledged that losing her was unthinkable. The canyon around them was still, but Tyan knew the calm was temporary. Threats would come again, and the land they traversed was unforgiving. Yet for the first time, he felt a quiet certainty that whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them with her side by side, heart to heart. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain, Tyan realized that in saving her once, He had not just preserved her life, he had forged a partnership, a bond that would define both of their futures, tested in fire and strengthened in trust. The afternoon sun bore down relentlessly on the canyon as Tyan and Alara moved cautiously through a narrow gorge. Though the earlier attackers had been repelled, Tyan knew that danger was far from over. His senses were alert, every muscle coiled for action. But even warriors are not invincible, and fate often strikes when least expected. A sudden shout echoed from above, and before Tyan could react fully, a volley of arrows whistled through the air. One struck him in the shoulder, sharp and burning, and he stumbled, barely catching himself on the jagged rock wall. Pain surged through his body, stealing his breath. He gritted his teeth, refusing to give in, but the world blurred for a moment as he realized the severity of the wound. "Ilara," he called, voice strained. She rushed to his side, eyes wide with fear and determination. "You must stay still," she shouted, gripping his arm. But Tyan shook his head, the warrior instinct refusing to surrender. "We must move. Now," he gasped, though every movement sent waves of pain through him. Ilara assessed him quickly, her mind racing. She had followed his lead for days, learned from him, trusted him, but she had never anticipated this. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy stone. For the first time, the protector had become the protected, and she understood the cost of courage. "Lean on me," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I will carry you if I must." Tyan allowed her to support his weight, wincing with every step. The path was treacherous, narrow ridges and loose stones threatening to betray them. Yet Alara moved with determination, her hand steady, her focus absolute. She treated his wound as best she could while maintaining their pace, pressing her hands firmly against the arrow's entry point to slow the bleeding, murmuring quiet encouragements he could barely hear. For Tyan, the vulnerability was disorienting. He had saved countless lives, endured battles that would have broken lesser men, yet here he was, utterly dependent on another, and not just any other, Ilara. The realization struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He was not merely surviving. He was trusting her with his life. And in that trust, a flood of emotions long denied swept over him. Gratitude, admiration, and most dangerously, love. Hours passed. The sun shifted, shadows growing long across the rocks. Ilara carried him as best she could, improvising support with branches and cloth, applying herbal salves she had learned to use under his guidance. Tyan could feel her presence in every movement. The rhythm of her breath, the warmth of her hands, and the quiet determination that kept them both alive. Finally, they reached a sheltered grove, hidden beneath an overhang of rock and thick brush. Ilara lowered him carefully onto a bed of moss and leaves, examining his wound once more. "It's deep," she admitted, voice tight with concern. "But it's not fatal. We'll mend it." Tyan tried to smile, but the pain made it a grimace. Still, he managed a nod. "You are remarkable," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I should have known. You could handle this." Ilara brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her eyes soft. "You taught me everything I needed," she said. "Now it's my turn to protect you." The moment was fragile, charged with intimacy and unspoken feelings. Tyan felt the ache in his chest deepen, not from pain but from recognition. Here was the woman whose life he had saved, now returning the favor, saving him in ways far beyond the physical wound. And in that act he realized the full depth of what he felt. His heart, once guarded and resolute, was no longer entirely his own. As night fell, the grove bathed in silver moonlight. Tyan rested in Ilara's care. He felt her presence like a shield, her hands steady, her voice calm. And as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he understood that the price of courage was no longer measured in scars alone, but in the risk of opening one's heart, in surrendering to a bond forged in danger, trust, and undeniable love. For the first time, Tyan allowed himself to imagine surviving not for duty alone, but for someone who had become inseparable from his soul. And as he drifted into darkness, the realization settled firmly in his chest. In saving him, Ilara had claimed a part of his heart he would never retrieve, and he did not want to. The first light of dawn filtered through the canyon, painting the rocky walls in warm hues of gold and amber. Tyan's shoulder throbbed, a dull reminder of the arrow wound that Ilara had tended with such care. But he felt alive in a way he had never known. Awake not just in body, but in heart. The grove that had sheltered them through the night seemed impossibly serene. Yet Tyann knew that danger still lingered beyond its edges. Ilara moved beside him, her steps careful but confident. She had stayed by his side through the ordeal, her courage and determination unyielding. Tyann glanced at her, seeing not just the woman who had healed him but the companion who had faced fear and peril with him, whose presence had reshaped the way he viewed the world. His heart, once guarded and cautious, now thumped with a rhythm he could not contain. "Ilara," he said quietly, stopping beside a clear stream. She looked at him, eyes attentive, waiting. Tyann drew a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, steeling him. "There is something I need to say. Something I have felt for days, perhaps longer." Her gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You don't need words to show me," she replied. But Tyann shook his head, needing to speak, needing the confession to take form. "I have carried many burdens," he began, voice low and deliberate. "Many losses, many battles. I thought I could survive alone without connection, without anyone to rely on. But I was wrong. I realized in saving you and seeing your courage and your heart that life without someone by your side is empty. My heart," he paused, searching her eyes. "It belongs to you." Ilara's breath caught, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. She stepped closer, closing the small space between them. "And mine," she said simply, her voice firm yet tender. "I trusted you from the beginning, Tyann. Not just your strength, but your heart. I would follow you anywhere." Tyann felt the tension in his chest dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread like wildfire. He reached for her hand, holding it gently, reverently. The simple touch carried more meaning than words could convey. Shared survival. Trust, admiration, and now love, raw and undeniable. Before they could linger longer in that fragile intimacy, a distant shout ripped through the canyon. Tyann's body tensed immediately, the warrior in him resurfacing. A small group of bandits, or perhaps remnants of the earlier attackers, emerged along the ridge, moving swiftly and with purpose. He glanced at Ilara, noting the spark of readiness in her eyes. She was no longer merely someone to protect. She was a partner, a force beside him. "Stay close," he whispered. "We face this together." They moved with precision and synchronicity, Ilara following his lead yet acting decisively on her own. Tyann dispatched the first attacker with swift, practiced movements, while Ilara used a fallen branch to subdue another, her agility and courage complementing his skill perfectly. The battle was brief but intense, each second a test of reflex, trust, and intuition. When the dust settled, the attackers had fled, leaving Tyann and Ilara standing together amid the rocks and shadows. He lowered his bow, chest heaving, and looked at her. There was exhilaration in her expression, yes, but also a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had been tested and proven true. "I could not have done this without you," Tyann admitted, voice low. "Nor could I have faced my own heart without you." Ilara stepped closer, brushing the sweat-soaked hair from his brow. "We've faced danger together, and now we face what comes next. Whatever that may be, I want to face it with you." Tyann felt a surge of emotion so powerful it made him tremble. The battle was over, yes, but the true victory was the bridge they had built, between fear and trust, between caution and surrender, between two hearts that had been guarded and now beat as one. As the sun climbed higher, casting the canyon in golden light, Tyann drew Ilara into his arms. Their embrace was quiet, yet it carried the weight of all they had endured. The wounds, the dangers, the moments of fear and vulnerability, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they had surrendered, fully and irrevocably, to each other. For Tyann, it was the culmination of everything he had learned. That courage was not only in battle but in vulnerability. That strength was not only physical but emotional, and that the heart, once lost or guarded, could be found again in the most unexpected of ways. And as they stood together, the canyon around them alive with light and shadow, Tyann knew without question that whatever threats lay ahead, they would face them side by side, hearts entwined, unbroken, and unafraid. The first light of morning spilled across the canyon like liquid gold, washing the jagged rocks and dusty trails in warmth and promise. Tyann stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind tousling his hair, the weight of the past days pressing lightly on his shoulders. Beside him, Ilara adjusted the pack they would carry for the journey ahead, her movements calm and confident. Gone was the fear and hesitation of their first encounter. In its place bloomed a quiet strength and a profound trust, both in each other and in the path they would walk together. The canyon that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving now appeared alive with possibility. Birds wheeled through the morning sky, their songs carried on the wind, and the distant river sparkled in the sunlight. Tayen inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. Aware of every sensation, the roughness of the rocks beneath his boots, the warmth of Ilara's presence beside him, the steady beat of his own heart. For the first time in years, he felt complete, not merely surviving but truly alive. "Ilara," he said softly, turning to her. She looked up, meeting his gaze with eyes that reflected the same mixture of determination, gratitude, and something deeper, love. "We made it," she said, her voice gentle, yet carrying the weight of all they had endured together, not just through the canyon but through everything. Tayen nodded, the memory of danger, pain, and sacrifice flashing through his mind. He thought of the wound he had carried, the moments of fear and uncertainty, the countless times he had faced loss and despair, but he also thought of the courage, loyalty, and love that had grown between them, transforming those trials into something profound and lasting. "I could not have done it alone," he admitted, "and I do not wish to ever face life alone again. Not with you." Ilara stepped closer, her hand brushing his. The touch was light, yet it carried the weight of all unspoken emotions, the fear, the gratitude, the admiration, and the undeniable pull of hearts intertwined. "Nor I," she replied. "We face the world together now, Tayen. Whatever comes, we face it as one." The sun rose higher, bathing them in light. Tayen reached for her hand, holding it firmly, confidently, as if anchoring both of them to the certainty of the moment. "Then let us walk forward," he said, his voice steady, calm, and full of promise. "No more running from danger, no more hiding from life, and no more guarding our hearts." Ilara smiled, a smile that carried both relief and exhilaration. "Together," she agreed. They began their descent from the cliff, moving with practiced ease along paths they had once feared. The canyon, which had been a crucible of hardship and survival, now felt like a sanctuary, a place that had tested them, shaped them, and ultimately united them. Every step was a testament to their resilience, their trust, and the bond that had been forged in the fires of adversity. As they walked, Tayen found his gaze drifting repeatedly to Ilara. The woman who had been fragile and frightened when he first found her had transformed into someone strong, capable, and fiercely alive. And yet she had not lost her gentleness, her empathy, her capacity for love. He realized with quiet awe that in saving her, he had not only rescued a life but had discovered the truest companion for his own heart. They paused briefly beside a shimmering pool fed by the canyon's river. Tayen knelt, cupping the water, and offered it to Ilara. She drank, then smiled at him, a silent acknowledgement of partnership and equality. Tayen mirrored her smile, feeling an unfamiliar lightness, a joy born not of conquest or victory, but of shared survival and mutual trust. The canyon stretched before them, vast and untamed, yet no longer threatening. Its challenges remained, of course, dangers in the wilderness, uncertainties in the world beyond, but they would face them together. Tayen felt his heart swell with a confidence he had never known. The warrior in him would remain, yes, but it was joined now by a heart that had surrendered without fear, that had opened fully to love, and that would never again be guarded against the possibility of connection. As the morning deepened into day, Tayen and Ilara continued their journey, side by side, hands intertwined, hearts aligned. The canyon behind them had shaped them. The wounds they carried had taught them, and the trials they survived had bound them. Ahead lay a world of unknowns, but they would step into it as one, fearless in their courage, steadfast in their trust, and unbreakable in their bond. And in that new dawn, Tayen understood what he had long denied, that the greatest survival was not of body alone, but of heart, and that the heart, once given freely, could create a life far richer and more enduring than any warrior's solitude ever could.